Okay, today's topic is Gevinas Yisroel, and that is to say that the Chazal made a takana that you have to have Chol Yisroel. Jew has to be when they milk the cows, but they made a second Isser, and that's called Gevinas Akum, which says that when you set the cheese, that when you create the cheese, you have to make sure that cheese that the rennet that they use, the thing that turns the milk into cheese, that rennet should not come from a kavus nevela. That you could take that rennet could be taken out of the stomach of a cow, the fourth stomach called the keva, and if it would be taken out from a keva of a nevela, of an animal that did not have shchita, it would make the food treif, it would make the cheese treif, and therefore Chazal said we have to do something. We'll talk about what that something is, but we have to do something to make sure that they did not use kavus nevela to do this. Which, well, let me just explain for a drop more, is that if you take milk and you add this rennet to it, what happens is the rennets, the milks, it causes the milk to separate into curd. That's what becomes the cheese, and the leftover, which is called the whey. And so, if the rennet that was used to do that separation would have come from an avela, then the treif would be treif because because the rennet would have been a maimed, it would have made the cheese treif. So Chazal asked us to have Gevinas Akum. Okay, we'll talk soon about what that means, what it takes to make it, what makes it Gevinas Akum, or what makes it Gevinas Yisroel. But there's some kind of a takana separate from the requirement for Chol Yisroel, is this requirement that we should have Gevinas Yisroel as well. Now, when we spoke once beforehand about the different ways that types of cheese there are, we broke them down basically into two groups. There's something called rennet set cheese, or some might refer to that as hard cheese, and that's like cheddar cheese and mozzarella cheese that use rennet to cause the cheese to form. And there's another kind of cheese called acid set cheese or soft cheese. Well, that's like a cottage cheese or a cream cheese. Now, in those, an acid is used. Something acidic is used to separate the cheese part of it from the leftover, to make the milk split into the cheese and the non-cheese. Now, rennet set cheeses obviously need Gevinas Yisroel. That's exactly the kind that you would put in the kavus nevela into it, and therefore that's the one that Chazal said needs to have Gevinas Yisroel. What about an acid set cheese? The way you do it is you add something acidic, like vinegar or lemon juice, or you can let it sour by itself. It could naturally sour. So the question is, do those need to be Gevinas Yisroel also? So on the one hand, you make them without rennet. So why would anybody be concerned that the person put in kavus nevela? You don't put in kava in at all. You don't put rennet at all. You put in something acidic to make it happen. So logically, there's no reason why Chazal should have been concerned that this cheese should need Gevinas Yisroel. On the other hand, when Chazal make takanas, sometimes the reason for the takana is different from the structure of the takana. So here the reason for the takana is because they were concerned that the people might use kavus nevela. That's true. But the structure is that all cheeses are, unless it's Gevinas Yisroel. So maybe all cheeses are included in that. Soft cheese is included. It would be sort of like a light plug that all cheeses are included, even the ones that there's no chance, no reason to think at all that they might use a kavus nevela for. Okay, that's a question of which way you should look at it. Now, one could say that I said just maybe, I just said that maybe it's a light plug that all cheeses are included, but there is a way to look at it otherwise, and that is to say there's another term, chema, which means butter, and that's used as a way to describe things that are not milk and they're not cheese. They're something in between, like butter. It's not plain milk, but nor is it cheese either. So it's possible to say that the soft cheeses would go into that category called chema, butter, which does not need any kind of, like, so to speak, Gevinas Yisroel. Now, I've been talking to you now about soft cheeses like cottage cheese and cream cheese. But there's an even stronger argument to not need Gevinas Yisroel for yogurt and sour cream. They're also in the group that we'd call soft cheeses, but they're very different from hard cheeses or even from other soft cheeses. And that's like this. A hard or a soft cheese is the curd, which is to say the protein and sometimes fat. The curd separates from the rest of the milk, and that curd is what we eat as what we call cheese. That's what a regular cheese, a hard cheese or a soft cheese. The only difference between hard and soft is just the hard cheese, rennet does that job, and in a soft cheese, it's an acid that does that job. But that's very different than sour cream and just about all yogurts, because there we don't separate curd from, we don't eat only the curd and leave something behind, leave the whey behind. We eat the entire milk. The whole thing, the whole container of milk turns into sour cream or into yogurt. So those seem the least likely to be considered to be required to have Gevinas Yisroel, because they're not cheese at all. I mean, in no way did we separate any curd and that we should call this Gevinas Yisroel. So the bottom line is the Hashgachah and the Hashgachah seem to hold that soft cheeses also need Gevinas Yisroel. The Hashgachah is makel about sour cream, but they seem to hold that all cheeses, even soft cheeses, require Gevinas Yisroel. Ramosha talks about maybe the possibility to be makel, because maybe it's not, maybe there's a reason to be makel about soft cheese. He's not happy about that. He says, but you shouldn't protest those who are makel, but he himself does not think that that's correct. And in fact, the Star K follows that shita. They won't give hashgacha on soft cheeses unless it's Gevinas Yisroel. We'll find out soon what Gevinas Yisroel means, but unless it's Gevinas Yisroel. But most of the hashgachas follow Rav Henkin, who said that we do not have to be makbid on Gevinas Yisroel for soft cheeses, and that's why there's lots of national brands of cream cheese and cottage cheese that have hashgacha, because it's really easy to make it. You don't have to have what we'll see soon. What it takes to make Gevinas Yisroel, it's quite a complication, which makes it not realistic for most of these national brands to be to make the cheese kosher. Now, Ramosha says that if you're makel about soft cheeses and you say that they don't need to be Gevinas Yisroel, he says, the person said, well, wait a second, but there are people nowadays who when they make even a soft cheese, they throw in a drop of rennet into it also. It's not a rennet set cheese at all. It's this acid set cheese. It's a soft cheese. But they throw in a little bit of rennet to help speed it up. Ramosha said, no, that's just supporting. It's not really doing the job over here. It's not really the cheese. And the cheese is really being set by the acid, and the rennet is just a side thing over here, and it doesn't make a difference. It does not make it a kind of cheese that should need Gevinas Yisroel. Okay, well, how do we know whether something is a rennet set cheese or an acid set cheese that has just a little bit? So when I asked professionals who make cheese about this, they said it's very clear. They showed me how it's very clear to know the difference between the rennet set cheeses and the acid set cheeses, and it has to do with how much rennet you put into it. Even if you put rennet into the acid set cheeses, they put such a tiny amount, it's very obvious what it is. They tend to range in the numbers that they use is 70 to 90 milliliters of rennet for every 1,000 pounds of milk. 1,000 pounds is about 116 gallons or 439 liters. So it's about 70 to 90 milliliters in 1,000 pounds of milk. And for an acid set cheese, you put 1 or 2 milliliters of rennet for that amount of milk. So the difference is very dramatic. It isn't like there are things in between. There's all up the high number of like 70 to 90. And then there's ones at the very low number, 0, 1, or 2, like, just a handful. And it has they're very separate. It's very, very easy to tell by looking by how much they put in to know which kind it is. Now, Rabbi Gersten pointed out that in the United States, we call single strength rennet, we call it when it has 200 IMCUs. That stands for International Milk Clotting Units. That's how they measure the rennets, that strength. In Europe, a single strength one is 130 to 140 IMCUs. Also, you could buy rennet that's more or less concentrated, the double strength rennets and triple strength rennets, even 10 strength rennets. So you have to just bear all this in mind. The fact that we put in this amount of milliliters has to just bear in mind, was that single strength or double strength? If we put in 10 times strength and we put in 7, well, that's the same as 70 of single strength. Okay, so those are all things to bear in mind. I'll mention also that Rav Shlomo Hirsch Adler once did an experiment. He took 5 milliliters of rennet, which is way more you'd put in soft cheese, and just put into 1,000 pounds of milk. Well, he had a company put into 1,000 pounds of milk to see what would happen. Would it do anything to the milk? And in fact, nothing. Nothing happened at all to the milk. It made no difference to the way the milk was. And that supports this idea that the rennet in these soft cheeses is not doing anything by itself. It's only there helping out what the acid would do. Now, because of this sheet of Ramosha, that if you're makel about soft cheeses, you do not have to worry about the fact that there's a little bit rennet into it. That's why, as I mentioned, there's lots of these national brands of soft cheeses like cottage cheese and things like that are kosher. They don't have any mechanism to make them Gevinas Yisroel, but it's going within a position that they don't need to be Gevinas Yisroel. So let's just give it just a summary of some cheeses that are. Some of the cheeses that are considered acid set cheeses, the soft cheeses that don't need Gevinas Yisroel, are baker's cheese and cottage cheese, cream cheese. I'm doing alphabetical order. Farmer cheese, mascarpone, nufshatel, I bet I didn't pronounce that right, paneer, sour cream, and yogurt. Okay, now some of the cheeses that are considered rennet set, and they do need Gevinas Yisroel for sure, Asiago, blue cheese, cheddar cheese, Colby, Edam, Feta, Gouda, Monterey, Mozzarella, Munster, Parmesan, Romano, and Swiss cheeses. Okay, so now we've talked about which cheeses need Gevinas Yisroel. Let's now move to find out, well, what does it take to make Gevinas Yisroel? What does that mean? I keep telling you it has to be Gevinas Yisroel. What does that mean? So there's two big opinions about that. The Ramah says that the same way you make Chol Yisroel is how you make Gevinas Yisroel. Just like when by Chol Yisroel, the way you make sure that they only got milk from a kosher animal is that a Yid has to watch it. So too, when you make Gevinas Yisroel, is that a Yid has to watch to make sure they use they don't use keva from an avela. You have to make sure they use the right rennet, the kosher rennet, rather than a treif rennet. Okay, and logically, it makes a lot of sense. You watch the person doing it, you make sure he does it right. That's what Chazal had in mind to make sure that it's Gevinas Yisroel. The Shach says he makes it diak in the way the Mishnah says it. The Mishnah by Chol Yisroel says the Yid has to watch it. By Gevinas Yisroel, it just says the Gevina of a Yisroel or Gevina of an Akum. So the Shach says like this. He says just watching it doesn't make any difference, because the din is that if you're 100% sure that they use vegetable rennet, you didn't use animal rennet, it's still not kosher. It doesn't help just to be sure. Being sure is not enough. He says so. Watching is just a way to be sure, and sure, the Shulchan Aruch tells us, is not enough to make it to make the cheese kosher. Rather, what you have to do is either the Yid has to own the cheese, or he has to be part of the cheese making. So if he owns the cheese, then it's Gevinas Yisroel, means it's the Jew's cheese. That's what makes it. Or if he participates by what they'll do is they'll put in the rennet. That's what makes it to be Gevinas Yisroel. Okay, so he sees Gevinas Yisroel more like the takana of Pas Yisroel. That by Pas Yisroel there was a Chazal made takana, but they structured it to say is a Yid has to be part of the baking. Over here also a Yid has to be part of the cheese making as the way to make sure that they use Kevis Nevela. Now most Lachronim follow the Ramah that it's enough to watch it. And the Aruch Shulchan says, "L'maisa lechatchila, you should try to be machmer for the shach," and so all hashgachas make sure, all reputable hashgachas make sure that they follow what the Ramah says. The Ramah says that you have to watch the cheese making, all to make sure that a Yid is following watching the cheese making. Now it used to be that all the hashgachas, all the major hashgachas in the United States, also were machmer for the shach as well. That the Yid who was watching would also put the rennet into the vat, so he could fulfill the shach also. In recent years, some of the large agencies have backed away from that, and they just follow the Ramah. They don't do the shach. And the reason why they do, what was pushing them to do that was it lets companies make cheese even on Shabbos. On Shabbos, the Yid can't put the rennet in, so it lets them make it on Shabbos. And the Yid watches, but he just doesn't participate. And also, it lets them give hashgachah in these huge plants they're running 24/7, and it's almost impossible for a Yid to put in the rennet into every single vat. So just having him watching it is more realistic for them to pull it off in that kind of a case. Okay, one more thing to mention here before we get to some details of the Ramah and the Shach is the din of Gevinas Yisroel is you have to do these steps to make sure that the rennet that you put in is not from Kevis Nevela. So in that, thinking of it like that, when you open up the container or the bag that has the rennet in it, it seems appropriate that the mashgiach should seal that afterwards to make sure no one puts something else into there. It would be pretty silly if you watched them pour something out of a bag when the thing they were pouring in was treif. So he should seal it to make sure that they only use that bag keeps holding only the kosher rennet that's in it. So now let's talk about some details of the Ramah and the Shach. Just for, again, the Ramah is we follow the Ikra din, and the Shach, many are still machmir to do the Shach. So let's talk about some of those details. So when we make Chol Yisroel, the Yid has to watch the milking, but the din over there is that it's okay if the Yid is Yotzev Nichnas. He doesn't have to watch every drop of milk come out of the cows. He could be Yotzev Nichnas, and that's good enough also. So Rebelsky said, that's fine for Chol Yisroel, but for Gevinas Yisroel, we need a higher level of proof, and therefore, it's not enough to be Yotzev Nichnas, the Yid has to be there the whole time. Rav Shachta said, no. He said the whole sheet of the Ramah that you need to have, that Gevinas Yisroel happens by watching, comes from the fact that he says it's exactly like Chol Yisroel. So if Yotzev Nichnas works for Chol Yisroel, it's going to work for Gevinas Yisroel also. That's the whole sheet of the Ramah comes from an understanding that Chol and Gevin are the same din. If they're the same din, if they're the same, the watching is this, what makes it Gevinas Yisroel is the same. You may need a higher level of proof, but essentially you have to. If Yotzev Nichnas works for Chol Yisroel, it's going to work for Gevinas Yisroel also. Now, a similar kind of question came up about using video cameras to watch the cheese making. which would make things easier because hey, if you watch by video camera, you could watch it remotely or from someplace else. It was a lot easier to watch a lot of things at once. So many of the poskim, contemporary poskim, thought that it's okay for a chol v'shol to watch it by video camera, and then so you could. That would seem logical to say, well, the same thing should be for Gevinas Yisroel also. If I tell you chol v'shol and Gevina are the same, it should seem like it could be. You might think that it should be the same, but you can argue also is that we really need a higher level of proof. And for chol v'shol, all we need to know is make sure that this is cow's milk. So if the camera lets you make sure, then the camera lets you make sure. It does the same job as you're watching it, literally physically watching it. But if you say that to make Gevinas Yisroel, you need something stronger. You don't just need to know that it's kosher ren. As I told you, even if you're 100% sure that's kosher ren, that's not good enough. You need a higher level of proof. Maybe that's not good enough to just watch on the camera. Okay. One last thing to think about within the Ramah is what happens when you have a very modern factory where nobody sits at the vat of milk and pours ren in it. There isn't anything happening. No one is standing by the vat to put the milk in. And everything works from a centralized control room. There's a control room where they push the buttons, or they just watch the program. It runs automatically, and it puts the rennet into the milk at the right times. So where should the mashgiach be when he wants to do what the Ramah says to watch it? Should he stand on next to the vat and watch the vat as it turns from milk into cheese? Should he do that? Should he stay in the control room and watch the machine that says the rennet is being put into it? Or maybe it's totally impossible. There's nothing to see. He can't watch them put it in because in the control room there's no rennet, and by the vat he doesn't see any rennet either. He just sees a lot of pipes pointing this way and that way. So what is he supposed to be doing to do Gevinas Yisroel according to the Ramah in this case? So Rabelsky, talking about a little bit of a different case, said is that the Yid's job is to make sure he has to watch that they're not using kevis nevela. He says his job to watch doesn't mean he should stand there, literally, in his words were, as an honor guard, just standing there where he's very dignified looking and standing next to the vat. That's not his point. His point is he's supposed to stand there so he could see that they don't use kevis nevela. So, where's the place to do that? Standing next to the vat is a waste of time because that's not where anything happens. What happens is in the control room. So that's the place. That's the place where the mashgiach should be standing to watch. What he should be watching is the decision or the critical part to make sure that kevis nevela is not put into it. But it would seem that if you're doing that, if we're going to have a mashgiach watching, so to speak, from the control room, seemingly the mashgiach should be the one to make sure that at least there is some tank someplace or some container that holds the rennet. That he should be the person putting the rennet into that tank, or watching that rennet being put into that tank, so that that rennet that's where they keep the rennet in there, because he's going to watch a machine that says take something from tank X and put it into the milk tank. Well, he has to make sure that tank X is actually the kosher rennet. Seemingly, it's not just a matter of him being tricked. If he wants to make it Gevinas Yisroel, that's his job, is to make sure that they're putting in kosher rennet. Well, that's the place to watch, is the tank that holds the supposed kosher rennet in it also. Okay, now let's move. We talked about some ideas of how, according to the Ramah, it would be Gevinas Yisroel. Now some questions within the Shach. So the Shach says it's Gevinas Yisroel if the Yid owns the cheese. And the Shach says there's different ways to do that. He says either the Yid could, so to speak, rent the cows so that the cheese will be his once it's made, or he can make up with them. I don't own the cheese yet, but I make up with you that if we make this cheese, you're going to make 500 pounds of cheese. I'm going to buy 200 pounds. He makes up beforehand how much is going to be his. So then this cheese is headed towards the Yid. It's going to be the Yid's cheese. The Yehuda says that not only that, it's also enough if the Yid owns the rennet that's in the making of the cheese. The rennet is just one little component, but that's enough also. He has a small ownership in the cheese, and therefore that also makes a greener that belong to Yisrael, that according to Shach, that would be good enough. Now, the Shach I mentioned says not only could you own the cheese, you could also participate in making the cheese. And so here again we have a question like we asked in the Ramah, is what happens if the machinery, if the rennet is not added in by hand, it's added in someone sitting at a computer. So what should we do about that? So Rav Shachta said that according to within the Shach's Shita, if the Yid programs the machine that says, when the vat gets this full, then let it in the rennet, that's good enough. Okay, and we were told also that the Eid HaChavedus in Yerushalayim says that's the Ikra Hadin. But just as a matter of policy, they say that the mashgiach should reprogram or restart the computer once a day, just that he should be more involved. Rav Belsky did not hold like that. He thought that when you program the machine, that means is the very next batch that comes out is considered your action. But once that next batch comes out, the fact that other batches come out later in the day based on your programming is not enough to make it Gevinas Yisroel. Okay, so now I'm just going to, repeat two small things that I've said beforehand, having to do with Kashering after Gevinas Akum. We will talk in Rich Hashem once in the future, different kinds of questions about Kashering for kosher cheese. These 2 points are more specific to the Gevinas Akum angle of it. And that is, the first is, the Ikra Din is that when you have Gevinas Akum, that's in a food, so it's treif, it's not mutter unless the mixture, the taruvas, is not mutter unless the Gevinas Akum is bought to b'shishim. The Chacham says that in the case of a hefse meruba, you could be makel and say that the mixture is mutter even if the Gevinas Akum is only bought to b'roiv, even if it's not bought to b'shishim. Okay, now that's important to us, not because we hope for mistakes, because we want to eat the food, but rather because in most cases, a food that has treif cheese in it, not always, but in most cases, the cheese is bata b'roiv. Usually it's less than 50% of the food is cheese. So what it means is that b'diavad, the food itself is kosher. Now, we're not telling people to eat it, but the point being is that if so, b'diavad, that the equipment that was used for that food that has, let's say, 20% cheese in it, or 5% cheese in it, that food, b'diavad, is really kosher. What didn't be kosher at all. So again, we're not thinking to be making about that to totally say that, because again, the Chacham Zalman says it's only makom hefse meruba, but Rav Shechter and Rav Schwartz both thought that it was an extra tziruf to allow when we kasher baking pans to use libun kal instead of libun gomer, which is to say is if the baking pan only had foods in it that the cheese was less than 50%, which is pretty common, it's basically impossible to do libun gomer to the pans. Libun kal is more reasonable. So following this tziruf together, if there are others, is potentially a way to kasher these pans, and rather than say they have to be thrown out and start again from scratch. Okay. And the second point is, I mentioned this before, and also is that in Hashgachah he brings from Practicum talk about what happens if you have something that was chalav akum or Gevinas Akum. Okay, we're talking Gevinas Akum, and you need to kasher it. But if you say that you have to kasher it, it's going to be, but basically it's impossible to kasher the kli. Okay, somehow it's impossible to kasher it. The question is whether that din that you have to kasher if the Gevinas Akum and chalav akum, he says it's a shayla and Practicum, whether that goes to the extent, even if it don't mean you can't kasher the kli altogether, and you basically have to throw it out. Okay, when again in a dairy factory, if they had ceramic pistons in the homogenizers, or they had a distillation column with ceramic packing in it, then those are cheres, they can't be kasher. So then would be relevant this question of, should we say that because of that it's impossible to kasher and basically you can't make kosher here, or we have to change out those pistons or packing, and then again that would be totally in this machlokes.